Welcome, I'm Rose Martin, and we are right around the corner in Roanoke with Heath Lee. Her book, The League of Wives, the untold story of women who took on the U.S. government to bring their husbands home from Vietnam, is a true story of some remarkable unknown heroines. They're lobbyists, they're activists, and boy, they still follow the military code of wives in order to bring these POWs home from the jungle. Her book is going to be a fascinating show. Thanks for joining us. So, hi, Heath.
Hi.
And so I'm got to be curious, what brought you to write a book about these fabulous women who stepped outside of protocol?
Well, like a lot of the work I do, it just sort of came very organically. My first book, Winnie Davis, Daughter of the Lost Cause, was all kind of a Virginia-based book. I finished that book. I was speaking at the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond and knew that, you know, the staff there who I've worked with many times over the years knew I was looking for a new topic. And they had just gotten the papers of a woman named Phyllis Galante, who happened to be a friend of my mother's. Phyllis had passed away recently, and they had gotten her papers at the museum. And they said, Heath, you might want to come take a look at these papers. It might be something you would be interested in. So I took a look at the papers, and it was like a treasure map. And I could just see the story all laid out, who I should talk to, fascinating women across the country who had really done something exceptional. So it literally just almost dropped in my lap.
So what were on these papers?
The papers were Phyllis's diaries, letters, materials she had collected during the time when she was a prisoner of war, missing in action activist during the Vietnam War. She had been a very high-ranking board member of a group called the National League of Families for Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia. Her husband, Paul, had gone missing as a POW, was a Navy flyer, had been shot down, and was imprisoned in the Hanoi Hilton, the so-called Hanoi Hilton, also known as Wa Lo Prison, in North Vietnam during the war. And she spent years trying to get him out. And
so what a treasure to walk in.
Yes.
And so your people who know you really well thought, oh, we've got this history buff, Heath.
Yes.
And so if there's someone who can really appreciate the fact that these papers landed in our museum, it was going to be you.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Did you always grow up loving history and trying to dig into stories?
Always. I always loved history. And I, remember as a kid, all I wanted to read were biographies. They used to have always, and there was a series, I can't remember who published it, but it was all women's history, which was pretty forward thinking because I was born in '69, so this was kind of in the '70s. And I remember reading about like Helen Keller and Marie Curie and different people like that were Susan B. Anthony and being another one. That's always what I wanted to read, and it's still pretty much all I want to read.
This sounds like destiny, right? As a young girl, you're already picking up on this. I see all the things going in place to get you ready for what you're doing today. And you grew up with a really strong role model. We've talked a little bit about your grandma off camera. How much of an influence was she on your life?
Yes. Oh, I just adored my grandmother. She was, very much of the Southern belle, beautiful, loved clothes and travel, and was just a very interesting person. Loved to read and write. And actually, this is her reading medal she got in 1935 when they used to give out real gold for medals at school. And it talks about, it was some kind of writing medal that she got. So I like to wear this a lot because it just reminds me of her. She passed away a couple of years ago and I was very close to her. My mother, though, was probably even more of an influence with reading and writing. She was a history teacher and economics teacher. She always loved history. We always had tons of books around. So nobody had to encourage me to read, but there was just always a lot of material. My dad was also a big reader, so that was always kind of encouraged, and they really supported me writing. I wrote for the Richmond News Leader for a number of years as like a teen correspondent.
Oh, how fun.
So that was really fun. And they always put me in positions where I could do well and write. So they were, both parents, very supportive of me doing that.
Well, and their love of history, too, took you into, before the books came out, you love museums, right?
Yes.
And curating museums and getting involved in that. What about that world fascinated you so much?
Oh, I just always loved museums, and particularly the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, where I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. And I would just go on Saturdays and like wander around. I just like being in museums. They feel like a really safe place where you can just go in there and escape. And I've always loved the visual, even though I'm more of a verbal person probably than a visual thinker. I always felt like I had a little bit of a deficiency there, and it helped me to go see art and see things to correct that. So it all kind of eventually came together when I started working in museums. I was usually the content producer, writing the labels.
I'm not surprised about this. That you're kind of looking at the story,
yes,
and then thinking about, oh, I wonder who wore this or who said this,
right? Or who is this person?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not.
What do they care about?
What did right? That what is the story behind? It wasn't actually the visual in and of itself. It was, what does that represent to me? What can I take out of it? And then, but I love working with artists and visual people to kind of bring that together. So exhibits for me have been very helpful. And with this book, doing an exhibit and writing the book at the same time was like the perfect storm, because the visual was the exhibit, the objects, the clothes, the text labels. And then I had the book, and they were both fermenting at the same time. And I think it added so much to do it together, even though it was insane and I was working and still am like 24 hours a day trying to get it all done. It really was a great way to approach a book, and I think unique. I don't know a lot of people that have done that. It might have been kind of crazy at the time, but I think it really paid off with the book and the photographs and the way the book was set chronologically.
And the way you just talked about how it balances out your ideas for you to see something visually and then to see the written word.
Yes.
Now that makes perfect sense. While you needed, it was really helpful for you to do both, because
Yes.
it made sense to keep you in your lane and to put all the pieces together, right?
Yes, exactly. It's just like you're saying, it was like putting the pieces together.
Yeah.
I saw it as kind of a quilt or a puzzle. And neither of which I'm good at. I'm horrible at sewing and anything domestic like that. I'm horrible at puzzles, but visual and written puzzles definitely are good for me. And seeing both also helped me, the visual helped me to say, is this really important or not?
Oh, good point, yeah.
So it kind of helped me select out, like an object that was really important would show up in the book in a written way. So it's an interesting process, and it just helped me sort things out.
So talking about that process, how long did it take to put this together?
Oh my gosh. Well, all my books take far too long. This was 5 years, start to finish. My last book probably took 6 or 7. I feel like I have to know everything about a subject before I really get into even the writing phase. It was a couple of years of just research.
Oh, so that's what you do. You don't write and then put the pieces together and see where the trail goes. You collect everything first.
Everything. I tend to collect at least the bulk of it first, and then I do end up going back and doing more interviews and adding to it. But I feel like I really feel like I have to immerse in the subject first. And this would involve doing interviews with people. This would also be that part of the process. But I knew nothing, for example, about Vietnam. Like not one thing. I had never taken a class in it. This was a subject when I was in school in the 90s. It was still kind of, I think, a political hot potato, and
Well,
people
and it affects everybody differently, right?
Yes, and not having lived through it, I didn't have any feeling like, oh, this is a horrible war, or, I mean, no wars are great, but I didn't have strong political feelings one way or the other because I didn't know enough to know. But getting into it with the ladies and seeing their point of view, that's what I reflect in the book. And it obviously was one of our most horrible wars and really affected people, I think, emotionally in a way that World War II did not. It was just a different type of war.
Well, and it was the first TV war.
Yes.
Right? So it was the first time that we were able to get footage and we were able to see things, and people were given a commentary instead of reports that you weren't sure whether or not they were true or not. Well,
Yes.
in which you covered with some of that even in this war, right?
Yes.
So talking about your
Right.
interviews, you had a chance to really sit down with some amazing people in order to get firsthand information from them. What was that like?
Oh, and that was incredible. Like, just to meet John McCain, Bob Dole, Henry Kissinger. I mean, you're going to get over your fear of interviewing anybody after you interview Henry Kissinger. That was the one where I was like, oh my God, I've done hundreds of interviews in my life and not usually nervous.
Right.
I was really nervous about that, and he had bulletproof glass around where his secretary was, and I bumped my head on it and practically knocked myself out right before I interviewed
You're
Dr.
like, this
Kissinger,
is not going well.
I was like, this is not going well, but I will pull it together.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, he did not see that. So I pulled myself together and we had a lovely conversation. He's charming. He's a diplomat. So really enjoyed meeting him. He was somebody I had always really wanted to meet. And then Bob Dole is one of the nicest, coolest people with just the driest sense of humor. Every time I see him, we talk about which barbecue is better, Kansas City barbecue. He is from Kansas, and I think Eastern North Carolina barbecue is better. So we have an ongoing barbecue debate there. He's just a really easy person to kind of hang out with and funny. John McCain was, very imposing, kind of intimidating, but he really gave me some key things in the book about the women from the perspective of a prisoner when they noticed that the treatment immediately got better. He said it was not gradual, it was just almost like a light went on and off. So he gave me some really key things for the book that only towards the end of writing the book did I realize what it meant, and that's true, I think, sometimes with research and writing, that you have to write the whole thing to know where the pieces go. And the McCain interview was a case of it took me a while. I did that early on, and it took me a couple of years to realize even the significance of what he had said.
And what a gift to be able to access, these three individuals, plus the others that you interviewed for this book, to be able to share that firsthand knowledge. Because, was Senator McCain being there, right?
Right.
And knowing, and then be able to give you that firsthand knowledge. And Henry Kissinger played such a role, along with Bob Dole, in your book, with really being advocates.
Yes.
And being ahead of the time, and even bucking the system a little bit.
Yes. And particularly Bob Dole on that. I mean, he was, a young senator, and this was kind of one of his first big issues. And he saw immediately, I think, he had been in Washington for quite a while, but he could see immediately that this was just a gaping hole, that nobody was supporting POWs and MIAs. And as he told me, nobody even knew what a POW was or what an MIA was, which is still so puzzling considering we had the Korean War and World War II, but it was almost like a denial of what was going on. And it was a much smaller number of prisoners of war than we had in previous wars. So people were just conveniently forgetting, and he gave the ladies a platform and helped them and really brought that issue to public attention in a way that most politicians at the time didn't care to do.
And there were some assumptions about the fact that the Geneva Convention existed and that those rules were going to be followed and that the Red Cross had access. So they were just automatically going to be in taking care of people that were captured. But that wasn't the case.
That was not the case. And as one of the men who eventually went missing, his name was Chuck Stratton, said, the Geneva Convention card I carried was not worth the paper it was printed on. It was a joke. The pilots all knew going in that if they were shot down, those Geneva Conventions would mean nothing. So, and even today we debate over these things, and the sad fact is that the Geneva Conventions, in a war is a war, and people don't play by the rules. I think that's the inherent nature of war. So these poor POWs were tortured, they were starved, they were beaten, not given medical care. The North Vietnamese were violating every single rule possible, yet the American government wanted my ladies to keep quiet, to not say anything about what was going on, even when they knew through coding letters to their husbands that they were being tortured.
Right, because the propaganda coming out was showing people who were well-fed, staying in houses, with local families.
Ridiculous.
And it wasn't at all what was happening. And in fact, how were they being treated?
Yes, in fact, that was just a complete lie. As you said, propaganda was the word for it. That was being put out there widely, not just by the North Vietnamese, but also by some of the so-called peace activists or anti-war activists were saying, oh, they're teaching children English in Hanoi. I mean, it was just a big lie. So they were beaten, starved, no medical care. I mean, just horrible torture that went on and on and on. And some, unfortunately, died from it. It was really miraculous to me that most of those POWs actually did survive. Some did not, but the majority of them were somehow able, it was almost superhuman in some cases, to make it through that horrible period of time. But what helped so much was the ladies in my book finally go public with the knowledge that they have that the men are being tortured
and shackled
and isolated, right, solitary confinement for months, for in some cases almost a year. They finally go public with this, and the world is horrified, as they rightly should have been. And that does more, in my opinion, and part of the thesis of the book, that does more to spring these guys from the Hanoi, Hilton, and related prisons than anything our American government did until we get to the end of the war. And then there's some military actions that definitely end the war. But the women did a huge service to these guys, and John McCain was one of the ones that said, you know, keep quiet was the wrong call. When the women finally go public, that's when we see the change in treatment for the better.
And I love the fact you talk about them as your ladies.
Oh, yes.
I think that's awesome. So let's let everybody kind of come up to speed. So you have these Navy wives,
yes,
and they're in Coronado, which is pretty much a very affluent area. And to be a Navy pilot, you know, again, you're not an enlisted guy. You're a Navy pilot. You go through that SEER training, so you know exactly what you're going to be getting yourselves into. Right. But yet we're at a time period in our history where, you know, women aren't necessarily wearing pants, and we'll get to that in a second too.
Yes.
But you know, that we have them following this code of conduct from being a Navy wife. What was in some of that code of conduct and for the Air Force wives too?
Yes, and it is across the military. And I did start, and the book starts in Coronado, as you've mentioned, with the Navy wives. And this eventually spreads to all the military branches, but particularly Navy wives because their husbands are aviators. So they get shot down in the air war. But the protocol guides, as I call them, and many people call them the Navy wife, the Army wife, the Marine wife, are a series of books written with the support of the military by former military wives that have prescriptions on everything from your wedding night lingerie to taboos in social situations to how your children should act, what you should wear, deployments overseas. It has a lot of good practical advice, but it also has a lot of social prescriptions and conventions from the 1960s, which when you read them now just look ridiculous and really constraining and very, you know, but you do have to look at it through the time period. So women in the 60s, this is pre-first wave feminism, pre-Gloria Steinem, and these are conservative military wives, and they all live by the rules as they've been taught to for decades.
And it's funny, a friend of mine was a Navy wife of a SEAL commander, so I called her and I'm like, do you really have these books? And she said, yes. And as a matter of fact, they had fitness reports that had a box on them where the commanders or the officers, they would get graded on their family's behavior or their families. That was part of their report. You know, in your book, you talk so much about how it first evolved with Sybil. And, you know, when we think about these ladies who are the core of really turning some things upside down.
Right.
Going against the military, fighting the U.S. government, going to Hanoi and releasing their husbands from the jungle.
Right.
So where did that first spark from Sybil come to the point that she's like, you know, I've waited, I've listened, I've tried to follow the rules, don't talk, and I'm done.
Yes, right. And Sybil is the origin of it all. She is the one and only founder of the National League of Families, and she is really where it all kind of ignites from. So she goes for her husband, Jim Stockdale, is shot down in 1965. She goes for a number of years not without doing anything. She forms the League of Wives in San Diego, kind of an early iteration of the League. And within a year or so, things are fermenting, things are growing. But she does not go public with what she knows until 1968. So she has 3 years where she is trying her best to play by the rules, be the military wife that not only the military expects, but her husband expects. All these women fear if they do come back, it could ruin their careers also if the wives are speaking out or agitating, not following the rules. So they're all very conflicted about what's to be done. And for all the prescriptions in the Navy wife and the Army wife, the Marine wife, there is nothing in those books about what do you do when your husband is shot down and is locked up at the Hanoi Hilton. There is zippo on that.
Yeah. And how hard that must have been. Now, were these only officers' wives, or were the enlisted wives included also?
They're mostly officers' wives for the most part, because most of the prisoners of war were usually Air Force or Navy flyers that were shot down. However, there's a woman in the book, Andre Rander, whose husband, Donald, was an Army enlisted guy, but he had a lot of special kind of undercover training, and he was captured in the Tet Offensive and held not in the Hanoi Hilton, but in a different prison in part of the country. So there were Army and enlisted prisoners, but very rare that would happen. Usually it's the officers that are the prisoners of war.
And when we think about racism and segregation at that time, Andrea, she was an African-American woman in this group, and yet that wasn't a part of how the women viewed her or her role, was it?
Right. So interesting. So Andrea is alive and well today, and we've done a number of interviews, and you go in expecting certain things when you do interviews, and you never should, because it's always surprising what you find out. And she said, no, race wasn't the problem among the wives. Rank. It was rank, not race, that was the problem at first. There is a military hierarchy, and I know your Navy wife friend has probably told you about this, where the officers' wives, the highest ranking officer's wife, Sybil was the highest ranking one in Coronado at the time, they take over if something happens to the husband. It's almost like a default, like automatic.
That surprised me so much that rank kind of went with the family members too, taking over. And actually, they had a high-ranking person on their side in Bob Burrows, this naval intelligence officer that helped them, didn't they?
Oh, I love Bob Burrows. He is one of my favorite characters in the story. So Bob, as you know, he is a naval intelligence officer, one of the few men that doesn't mansplain, to use a current word, to the women, where he's just talking down to them and condescending like LBJ was, or a lot of people in the State Department. He wanted to help these women. He could see how smart and determined they were and how skilled they were. So he kind of behind the scenes recruits people like Sybil Stockdale and Jane Denton, another high-ranking naval officer's wife from Virginia Beach, to code letters to their husbands, secret letters that are sent in
covert operations.
Covert. I mean, they're Jane Bonds. Yes, they're doing all this.
I love that, Jane Bond.
I just loved that. Because they really are. They're doing all this covert work. And
probably scared, right? Because what if they're found out?
Oh, they were terrified. And if they were caught, their husbands would be executed. The ones on the chopping block would be their husbands. So Bob Burrows was the one for the Navy that was able to coordinate some of these and have a lot of success. And what I really liked about him is he was like the James Bond character. He was a maverick. He was going to go up, under, around, all legally, not anything that would be considered illegal, but he was going to use any means possible to get the information into the camps and to give his wives the honest information he could that the State Department and the military was not giving them.
And he was such a great supporter of them. Would you be willing to read some for us?
Oh, I would love to, absolutely. Would you like me to read from the prologue of the book? Certainly. And this, I think, I like to use settings of place, to me, always work well in the beginning, to just give you that sense of what life was like in a particular part of the country. So this is from the prologue of the book. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt surveyed the flat, sandy fields of North Island on the Coronado Peninsula with an acquisitive eye. FDR, a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, saw enormous potential in these jackrabbit-infested plains. Within a few weeks of his visit, the president issued an executive order clearing Coronado of its longtime Army presence and claiming the entire area for a new naval base. With war in the Pacific raging, the island would become a recognized cog in the military success during World War II. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado was constructed on this barren spot in 1944, and Coronado was now the Navy's training base, its social center, and its incubator for outstanding pilots and their families. They flocked to the peninsula like migrating swallows, seeking out nesting grounds. With its Spanish-themed architecture, swaying palm trees, and beautiful stretches of beach, Coronado must have seemed like an exotic Shangri-La to its new inhabitants. As the Navy's dominance grew, so did the tight-knit naval community, which had its own unique rules and regulations. These rules created a military caste system whereby an officer's rank translated directly to his wife and family status in the community. The commanding officer and his wife were at the top of the military heap. The men and women knew their place within the system and obeyed orders both at work and at play. The crisp military element soon formed an essential part of the peninsula's cultural fabric. By the early 1960s, Coronado had plenty of children and munchkins too. Children ran rampant day and night all over A Avenue, where Naval Commander James Bond Stockdale, his wife Sybil, and their 4 sons, Jim Jr., Sid, Stanford, and Taylor, lived. There were at least 56 kids living on the Stockdale's block when the boys were small. One family that lived close by had 12 children. Their mother made daily grocery store runs to feed her brood and had a drinking fountain installed in their home. The bridge across the San Diego Bay that would connect the peninsula of Coronado to the city of San Diego in 1969 was not yet built. Consequently, there was almost no traffic for mothers to worry about. The children were out day and night, skateboarding, popping wheelies on their bikes, playing frisbee, and happily avoiding adult supervision. The older kids surfed at Coronado Beach, where the Navy SEALs began doing training exercises in 1962. Coronado in this era was straight out of a Beach Boys song, a small, idyllic Southern California town that looked like a Hollywood film set. No one yet knew that the biggest drama the island peninsula would see would not be of the cinematic variety. Instead, it would be born of the unexpected consequence of the Vietnam War, a conflict that would bring death to the island and wreak havoc on the lives of the town's high-flying Coronado Navy pilots, their wives, and their children.
Thank you so much for inviting us here into your home and to share the amazing stories of these women, the League of Wives. I'm inspired by them and I'm inspired by you. Thank you.
Thanks.
And also thanks to all of you for joining us. A special thanks to Heath again for her book, her research, shedding light on these amazing women. If you'd like to find out more of our conversation, please check us out online. Hear more of the great stories and what they did to help these men. I'm Rose Martin, and I will see you next time right around the corner.
Production funding for Right Around the Corner provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Anne Ray Foundation, and by viewers like you. Thank you.